So, Josh, today we're going to talk about why we're so fascinated with monsters.
Woo!
Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Philosophy of Horror podcast. My name is D.H. Hyde. I'm an artist and horror fan. Who are you, Joshua?
I'm Joshua Howard. I am an NLP and hypnosis coach, mostly focused with public speaking, test anxiety, and social anxiety.
So,
Woo!
Josh, we've been talking about Noel Carroll.
Mhm.
So, why does Carroll think we're so fascinated by monsters?
Carol's definition, probably not surprising to anybody watching this, is a little soft on this. His interest is that monsters violate our classificatory schemes, and he's mostly interested in why we would be interested in that more than what is really there. He thinks they're fascinating, they're disgusting, and they give us a way to be interested in the movie and in the narrative. But that's really all it is. They violate our classificatory schemes and give us an opportunity to just be fascinated and disgusted with it, which for me is a little bit problematic because you get to a space where you say, okay, so why are we fascinated and focused on something that we find so disgusting? And really, the place Carol goes with this is that narrative, like a film or a book or whatever, gives us a safe distance to look at something like that, so we can stop and experience it. Um, to make this a little too philosophical, it's like Carol is getting at, and Carol would hate this, which I find fascinating. Um, Carol is suggesting that if you were involved directly with a monster, you probably wouldn't find them like really curious and interesting. You would go, oh, I don't want that. Because they're, well, as Heidegger would call it, present at hand. They're right here in your moment doing stuff. But if we can
Mhm.
stop and have a moment where we can sit back and reflect on it from a distance, then we can start to see them as an object. And when you can see them as an object, then we can find them interesting because we can start to be curious about, ooh, what is that? But it's that safe distance that allows us that ability. And so this is why, like for Carol, again, he's not interested necessarily in your felt experience or you living through this horror, but the way that you experience watching a narrative or reading a narrative or listening to a narrative or whatever, experiencing a narrative somehow. And that the monster is really only interesting inside of that entire framework. So without that framework, monsters themselves are really like disgusting and vile and repulsive, and you don't want them to touch you, and you're threatened by them, and all the stuff we talked about in the previous episodes. And so really it has to be inside of the narrative scope for them to be interesting.
I watched an interview with Carol once and he talked about that and I thought it was interesting that his basic conclusion is like, well, you're not being killed by the monster, like you rationally know that you're safe, and so because of that you can be entertained by them.
Mm-hmm.
Which I mean, sure, but I don't see that as very deep. And I was disappointed that someone who wrote a book called The Philosophy of Horror wasn't gonna go more in depth than that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I mean, this is going to show my bias philosophically, but this is a problem with analytic philosophers in general. I feel like they really love to take the surface level and make it really, really like structured and figure out like what the surface level is. And you're like, okay, great, but like, what about like the rest?
Well,
They're
yeah,
like
and
this.
also, I mean, yeah, because he goes into all this stuff about, okay, this is what horror is. Revolves around a monster, and this is like how we know it, and it's this category that he wants to quantify. But if we if we aren't looking at why people even like it in the first place, like who gives a fuck what it is?
Yeah, exactly. And also too, it's like if the entire narrative spins around the monster, there really should be more discussion about like why we're so interested in the monster as well. Because like why is the main character interested in the monster if it doesn't want to be touched by it and whatever? It's like they're forced to be interested in the monster. And that force to be interested in the monster is also something that the audience is taking along with them. And so like even inside of Carol's model, like he's missing quite a lot of opportunity to talk about this, because if we're tracking the main character's story throughout, then we're not necessarily interested in the monster from a distracted place. We're actually interested in the monster present at hand. And
Right.
I feel like that's a an issue that isn't quite resolved in this. Maybe I'm being nitpicky here, but it just really seems to me, if we're tracking the main character, we're tracking the main character's interest in the monster, not our interest in the monster. And also, Noel Carroll refuses to embrace any qualia discussions about the subjective experience of the audience. So he wouldn't, like, you can't even put that box on there. And so it's weird to me that he doesn't have more about the way that the main character's interest in the monster causes us to be interested in the monster, because it's, if you're following the rest of his theory, it seems to me at least that that is necessary in what he's talking about.
Most stories involve some type of hero's journey. I mean, that's what we like to see in stories, right? We want to identify with the hero, or we want to hate the hero and see him like get thwarted or whatever. And I think that if Carol is interested in the narrative, then there's nothing special about horror aside from, oh, there's the scary monster, but there are villains in every hero's journey. That's what makes it fascinating, is you have a hero who overcomes a villain. And so it seems like he doesn't really distinguish like what's special about horror other than this monster thing, but then he can't answer why we're fascinated by them without just saying, well, we like following this narrative. But I mean, that could be true of any story, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say, like under Carol's model, that makes a horror film is that the monster is impure and threatening to you directly, and you don't want it to touch you, which isn't the case with most villains. Like, most villains in most stories are other humans. And so it's like maybe the main character doesn't want them to touch them or whatever, but they have like a wife and kids, or, a husband or whatever, and,
Sure.
family. It's like you start getting into those dimensions. And then in horror, again, you remember that the narrative creates a curiosity for the main character about figuring out and unpacking what this monster is so that they can defeat it. Which, again, I would say is, you could accurately say, is in a lot of movies, like a lot of like sci-fi and fantasy movies and action movies. They spend a lot of time unpacking who the bad guy is and then what they need to do to
Hmm.
attack them and all that stuff. So, but this is one of these problems that genre studies ends up having. And one of the major critiques of the psychoanalytic model, for instance, is that you could basically define every movie the same way that you define a Western. And so
Okay.
what ends up happening is that that genre ends up breaking down, because specifically because you can't really put a full box on it without it being able to bleed and shift into other things. So this is why, for me, I constantly want to think about horror narrative as a narrative where the main character is constantly in fear of their own death.
Right. And I would say that there are two things. Again, Carol doesn't necessarily care about my subjective experience as a viewer, which is frustrating to me because there are two main reasons I like horror. One, I think that it's almost like exposure therapy when I like watch or read a story about something that I'm afraid of, and then I see there one of the characters overcome that, then like there's this sense of like, well, it's not as scary because one can overcome this. Um, the second thing is that especially supernatural horror deals with death in a way that is in your face. And it doesn't try to sugarcoat it. It doesn't promise you an afterlife. It's like, no, dude, Jason Voorhees is here and he's stabbing you in the face, and then you have to confront death. And I find that to be really fascinating and also entertaining because it causes me to then reflect on my own mortality. Um, and I mean, frankly, like one of the reasons I like horror so much is because it seems like that's kind of the point of it, is to cause the viewer to reflect on their own mortality in a very in your face, aggressive way.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I wrote a term paper that got a very bad grade, specifically because the professor's mother had died like 6 months earlier, and she deeply misunderstood this paper. But what I
Mm,
argue is that in the modern world, death is very removed from us. Like most people in the modern,
Yeah.
particularly modern Western world, obviously, like there are obviously places in the world where this isn't true, but for a lot of developed countries, the thing is like we just don't really see death a whole lot. And like when somebody dies, it very deeply affects us because we almost live in like a death proof society. You know, it's like
Yeah.
people live for a very long time. The types of mortality things that used to kill people, like even when we were kids, are just not that prevalent. Like there are still people that shoot each other, but that you know the numbers of that has gone down. The numbers of drug overdoses have gone down in a lot of ways. The numbers of a lot of ways that people die, like car accidents and all kinds of things, have gone down just because of the increase in technology and the changes in legal structure and stuff like that. So as we get further and further and further into a society like that, we don't have a space for dealing with death. So it has a tendency to completely rip us apart emotionally when it does happen.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. I
I
agree.
so it like it's like you. I mean, I'm mostly agreeing with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because what you're getting at is that we don't really have this place to contact death, and so horror movies give us a chance to do that, and not only to do that with ourselves, but to feel the death of like all of our closest friends. Because not always, but most horror
Hmm.
narratives are about a group of friends who start to die, and one of them is
Right.
the one who ends up figuring it out and fixing it.
Yeah.
You know, obviously not all of them. Like, it's a Wonderful Knife, for instance. I feel like we talked about that in a previous episode. It's
Hmm. Yeah, we
a
did.
horror take. It's a horror take on It's a Wonderful Life, and
Yeah.
that movie has a kind of a different structure than that because she ends up going into a universe where she was never born, and so she doesn't have any
Hmm.
friends, and so she ends up making a friend, but it's a very weird person, and it makes for a weird story. And there's not like she cares about the other characters, so there's still that feeling of the group dynamic, but they don't care about her because they don't know who the hell she is, and so it
Yeah.
creates a weird thing. But again, for the most part, like I'd say like 99% of horror movies have a group that dies.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that horror movies bring out probably more than any other type of movie, and I would say even more than war movies, is they really emphasize the precarity and fragility of life in general, of one's own life. And also, they remind us of how, in a way, society protects us from monsters. Um, because what ends up happening in a horror movie or a horror book is this there's this monster who violates everyone's boundaries. I mean, and like all of the norms are broken, and this, person or thing or alien or whatever it is literally going around depriving people of their right to life, which we hold really precious, at least in Western culture. Um, and so you as the viewer have to sit there, and to me, that's what makes it horrific, is that this person is crossing everyone's boundaries. I mean, they're crossing the line in the most egregious ways. And then the characters have to navigate that. Well, what do you do when someone shows up and they don't adhere to norms and they violate boundaries and they threaten your life? And how are you going to react to that? And I think that that's what makes horror fascinating. But then again, like, that has a lot to do with my experience as a viewer, and Carol doesn't really seem that interested in that aspect of it, because I think for me, especially as someone who spent a long time studying politics and order and justice in society, like, there's all these justice questions that come out of a horror narrative, because we want to see justice for the victims. We want to see the monster get defeated at the end. And then in some movies, they don't, like in House of a Thousand Corpses, where the monsters get away, which is, I think, one of the reasons that that movie is so disturbing to me, is because you get to the end, and in most horror movies, you're like, okay, someone's going to survive, the monster's going to die, there's going to be justice, there's going to be some closure at the end, and not in House of a Thousand Corpses. It's actually the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. There are a couple of movies like that. Funny Games has a very similar end to
Hmm.
that.
Yep.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's fun about the horror genre is like you honestly don't like if you haven't seen the movie yet and you know you it's not produced by a super big Hollywood, you really don't know what's going to happen. Like, and there's a lot of horror movies where they have alternate endings, like Drag Me to Hell, for instance, where there's like
Hmm.
the happy ending and then like a really messed up one.
Yeah.
And I mean they're both messed up, but like one of them like
Yeah.
really messed up. And so yeah, that's always fun. So with what you're talking about, one of the things I was thinking about is how Carroll's approach differs from the psychoanalytic approach, because the psychoanalysts are really, really interested in quite a lot of the ways that we would be fascinated with monsters, because they're really saying, like, why are we so fascinated with these movies? What is going on here? And if you think about it with what you were saying, something you're kind of suggesting is that a monster is somebody who is completely, or something that is completely unrepressed. They don't have any, what the psychoanalysts call surplus repression. They don't have any of
Yeah.
these types of repression that allow you to live inside of a society. Like, for instance, we every day, like, you could just walk down the street and like go pee in a corner, but you don't, specifically because you have a series of repressions in your head about one doesn't do this, one doesn't do that, you don't do this way, you don't do that. And so a monster is somebody who doesn't have those types of repressions, or something that doesn't have those types of repressions.
Hmm.
Or in the case of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or vampires, or serial killers, or some of the other examples we talked about in the last episode, there are places where you do and don't have that type of repression. But
Well, and they all have that in common too. So like
mm,
when Carol talks about like what's a monster, he has the four criteria. I mean, the thing that is glaring to me that he leaves out is they're all completely unhinged and not bound by the rules of society.
yeah, exactly. And then the thing that's interesting is the other thing that you brought in at the end there was that the movie creates a situation where somebody, like one, is forced to oppress this monster to cause them to no longer be doing these horrible things.
Hmm.
And like you were talking about with justice, there's a sense there where sometimes things that people do are unjust because they shouldn't have done them. And then in order to fix it, we have to oppress them. Or like that's kind of the entire point of the judicial system in a kind of crude way. And
Right.
so what was interesting to me about that, though, is that's not something that a lot of the psychoanalytic film critics talk about, but it's something that you could, surmise and pull out of what they're saying and to further it. And so I found what you were talking about really interesting. And I think that because we've already delved into it, it might behoove us to just jump into the psychoanalytic approach and look at a couple of different
Oh
ways
yeah.
that they approach monsters. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. And because this is one of those areas where I think the psychoanalysts do a really good job at answering why we're fascinated by monsters, and in both fictional monsters, but I would also say true crime falls into this too, because true crime is super popular, and all that is like a reality TV version of horror, really, because
Yeah,
they're creating a lot of hype around like an actual criminal or a group of criminals, etc. But it has a lot of the same elements.
yeah, I would agree. True crime overlaps with the horror genre a lot, but the one thing that's missing usually is there's not that main character that's experiencing the
Right.
fear. It's taken more from
Exactly.
this like intellectual level. And what's kind of interesting is like true crime breaks Carroll's model, but true
Hmm.
crime is the prime example of actually being fascinated with a monster.
I
Because if you were
agree.
actually fascinated with a monster, then you're doing true crime. And in a weird way, like Carroll's theory applies better to true crime in some ways, and not in others because like you're missing the main character and that stuff. But the element around being interested and being fascinated by something that we would normally find disgusting and like somebody that's a monster, like true crime is pretty up there. Um, and it makes sense in a certain way because there are quite a lot of those like documentary style horror films. Excuse me, they're kind of like that. Like,
Oh
think about like
yeah.
Cannibal Holocaust and
Hmm.
one of the George Romero movies. I think it's Day of the Dead, maybe.
Okay.
Land
I don't
Land
think
of
I've
the
seen.
Dead. Maybe it's Land of the Dead.
I
It's
think it's
one
Land
of
of the Dead.
those.
I haven't seen that one.
But yeah, so there are definitely horror films that are taken from that perspective, and they kind of almost give you like a first person place inside of it. And so I think we found quite a lot of places where Carol's theory cracks when we're looking at things like this.
Sure.
But I think for me, true crime is the prime example of being actually fascinated with the monster. And I think
Yeah.
personally, there's more going on in the horror narrative than just that fascination. And and again, I feel like we're lacking that. But going on a little bit too long about Carol here. So again, for the psychoanalysts, the thing that they're majorly interested in is considering horror as a dream, because
Hmm.
psychoanalysts always want to see things as dreams so then they can do their dream interpretation on it. And
Right.
so films, books, all of that type of stuff. If you try to read them as fantasy, meh. But if you read it as like a dream or an example of a dream, then there's a very rich series of symbols and stuff that you can start to pull from
Oh, sure. And you
inside
can
of
bring
that
in the
system.
Jungian archetypes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, even before that, you get a better. They would say that a dream is a better approach to the unconscious than a fantasy, because a
Mm-hmm.
fantasy, for most psychoanalysts, particularly like Freud through Lacan, a fantasy or a desire is an expression of something you don't have.
Right. That whole thing about how desire comes from a lack of something and
Exactly,
yeah, and
exactly.
unfulfilled needs and urges and whatnot. Yeah.
Right. And so and like if you question it, they would say, well, like if you're hungry, doesn't that mean you lack food? Like you need more food. If you're thirsty, doesn't that mean you need to drink water?
Yeah, but I mean, considering their founder was a drug addict, I mean, he could tell you firsthand, like, just because I had a gram of cocaine doesn't mean I don't want another one. You know what I mean? So,
That's a very fair
like,
example.
like addiction, it breaks down that argument pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, I mean, Sigmund Freud would probably be very happy with like a room filled with cocaine. Yeah,
Yeah, and cigars. Yeah,
and cigars. Yeah,
yeah, he didn't smoke another cigar because of a lack. It's because he was massively addicted to the excess of smoking cigars.
exactly. And it was because he had so many of them available. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
it.
Yeah.
There's some interesting things in that, and you know, I'm a Deleuzian, so for me, the idea that desire is a lack is weird because it's also like a future projection, a way to like experience yourself in a different place, want to change things. It's like it's so much addition happens with desire.
Well, yeah, and
But that's a
you could even go back to Nietzsche with that too, and the idea of becoming that desire is actually like that thing that uh pushes us to become.
mhm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of places where desire isn't a lack, but all that aside, the psychoanalysts think that if you're looking at it as fantasy, you're kind of more pointing towards desire than you are towards the truth of the unconscious. Like a dream is something you don't have that much control over, so they see it as a full expression of the unconscious, and
Right.
so
Right.
they would say like,
Unless
okay,
you're
well,
occultist Peter Carroll. But anyway, that's a side note. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
oh, you're okay.
I just remember in one of Peter Carroll's books, Peter Carroll, the occultist, not Noel Carroll, he talks about the dream journal and how the aim of the occultist is to control their dreams. But anyway, yeah,
Oh
the
yeah, no, that's one of the things I think is pretty funny. You know, it's like, have you guys ever heard of lucid dreaming? It's been around for like thousands of years. Like Sigmund Freud was like the same time as like the theosophy people. You know, like
yeah.
they were right there. He just was like not into it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, but and not to go off on too many side notes, but did you ever read The Future of an Illusion by Freud? Which it was like
I
150-page diss track against religion, basically.
oh yeah yeah
And he
yeah yeah.
says that psychoanalysis is a science, and that's what makes it different from religion, and that it's like super objective, and that he can prove everything, whereas like religionists and spiritualists can't. Um, until the analytic philosophers came along, and they were just like, no, you can't prove yours either. So whatever.
Well, I mean, analytic philosophers give us beautiful things like the T theorem. Snow is white if and only if snow is white. And you're like, what? That's really fucking profound, dude. Like, I personally like the Mr. T theorem, which is I pity the fool who doesn't know snow is white. It's fucking stupid, but it's less stupid than the T theorem. Like the T theorem has to be the stupidest thing ever expressed by somebody ever. Like something is something if and only if it is that thing. You're like, that's a tautology, bro. Like, how the fuck did you make that as a philosopher? Like, you know, I'm a continental philosopher and I can look and go, that's a tautology, right? Like, how do you guys miss that?
Well, I'm a scientist, and I can look at that and be like, really?
Yeah, bro. Like, what? uh, yeah. So, but anyway, on to the psychoanalyst. So if we're looking at dreams, right? We're looking at expressions of the unconscious, and the unconscious is going to be expressing desires in a wide
Hmm.
variety of ways, whether or not they're positive.
Yeah,
And so, some of those desires are going to fall within a socially acceptable thing for all
right.
cultures. Right, like
Yeah.
very few cultures would appreciate somebody murdering somebody in the streets or just like like blatantly robbing from people or raping women in the streets. Like those are
Right,
like
right, yeah,
three kind of obvious things that like most civilized societies won't let you do, like
yeah.
ever
Michael
throughout the history.
Myers is a universal bad guy. I mean, that's yeah. We can
Exactly.
agree on that, right? Yeah,
Exactly, like running around and killing people that are part of the same city that you live in and have nothing to do with war is generally accepted as wrong,
yeah,
generally.
yeah.
So we can call those basic types of repression or oppressions. They're
Hmm.
basic. So the
Yeah.
society needs you to not like go out and kill people even if you want to. Like sometimes you
Hmm.
want to burn down your job, you just don't.
Yeah. Right.
And so there's that. And then there's also surplus repression and oppression, and that is coming from specific societies in general. So like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of, but not all societies have a bias against homosexuality, bisexuality, and things of that nature. So
Right.
for most of history, society has tried to oppress you into not expressing those desires. Because for the psychoanalysts, and take this or leave this, psychoanalysts believe that everybody is actually full tilt bisexual. But
Right. Yeah.
because of repression and oppression, you have stayed where you stayed.
Right.
And
Right.
so you would
Or
be
you
repressing.
went full tilt gay and to kind of reify it like the binary because you were like, well, I'm not this thing that repression tells me to be, so I must be this other thing. Right? Isn't that kind of what they would say about that?
I'm sort of, but the thing is like
Yeah.
oppression is from the outside, so that's people coming in like being a bigot or
Okay.
whatever in this case.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
what's going to happen is that the people who aren't persuaded by continuing to repress themselves are going to experience oppression, right? Like
Hmm.
being skinny guys who grew up in the 80s and 90s, like you and I experienced a lot of that type of oppression, right? Like um at least me, constant comments about my
Oh, me
sexuality
too.
and
Yeah.
things of
Oh,
that
yeah. No,
nature. So
body shaming because yeah, because I didn't fit the stereotype of like what a young man was supposed to look like physically. Yeah.
yeah, and
Being
what's
called
interesting,
girly and pansy and shit like that. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And the thing that's interesting about that is that there's like again a basic level of it where there are certain expectations of like males and females kind of in general, kind of,
Hmm.
and then there are the cultural expectations. And so
Yeah.
depending on how you're looking at it, the oppression and the oppression from others and the repression from yourself can either be basic, like it all culture share it, or surplus, this one culture does it.
Right, right. Well, the other thing that came to mind too, as you were talking about the culturally specific stuff, is that there are horror narratives where that is actually the horrific element, is you have one culture's practice, which is normative, but is horrific to the other culture. So Cannibal Holocaust is kind of like that, where cannibalism is normalized in the one culture, but then the people documenting it are horrified by what's happening, and then they actually get killed. And so then you cross even more lines. But also, Midsummer's kind of like that too, because you
Yeah,
have these people who are expressing what they think to be completely moral and normative, but the people coming into that community are completely terrified and disgusted.
I would agree. Midsummer is a perfect example of that. And so when we're thinking about how this works out, though, what's interesting for the psychoanalysts is that the monster gives you an opportunity to become somebody who doesn't repress,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
is something that's missing from Carroll's model, because the psychoanalysts are like, well, yeah, some people identify with the monster.
Well,
And
it's
I,
so go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, I know that happens to me sometimes. Like, Human Centipede is a perfect example of this. I find most of the characters in that movie, like, not very captivating. And I actually kind of like the killer guy better. And so sometimes you do root for the monster. And like from Carol's model, that's like a fucked up way to experience the movie. And like particularly like if you wrote a movie like that, you just be like, but why? Like American Psycho, it's like, but why is he the main character?
Yeah.
And for a psychoanalyst, that's not a confusing question at all. It's like, you mean people don't have like an id that has all these horrible desires that they have to repress all the time in order to live in society?
Well, exactly. And that's one of the things I think that makes horror disturbing. If we want to actually go there and say that, well, on this kind of unconscious level, maybe some viewers or most viewers are getting this kind of vicarious pleasure in like watching this person be completely unoppressed. And that's the entertainment value. But I think that that would deeply disturb Carroll and any other analytic philosopher.
Well, yeah, and I mean, what they would say is like, well, that's just like a subjective qualia thing, you know. Like some people are gonna, you know, some people are gonna watch the movie and laugh, and some people are gonna be horrified. That's why I don't write about qualia, I think would be what Carroll would
Yeah.
say. He would say, yeah, that's specifically why I don't go there. But I think the bigger problem that he has is when you have to raise the stakes for him to make it more problematic. And I think when you talk about a movie like American Psycho, or maybe like Sweeney Todd, if you could call Sweeney Todd a
Mm.
horror film, because Sweeney Todd is very much a revenge film. But like we were talking in the previous episode, like basically every revenge film has this exact problem that makes Carroll's model kind of crack, because the only way that
Yeah.
you can have the identification with an audience member is to actually sympathize with the people that are getting attacked. And for the most
Yeah.
part, you don't in those movies, because generally the stuff that they did to this person is so abhorrent that you're not saddened by what they're doing. And
No,
so
but I
the only
mean,
thing you could do in Carol's model is either argue that those revenge films are not actual horror films or something else, or you have to figure out a way where you can identify with one of the people. Like in I Spit in Your Grave, how are you supposed to identify with one of the rapists? Like you identify with a gang rapist? That's kind of
right.
fucked up.
Right, right. But even like the like 1980s slasher movies, like the first Friday the 13th, you know, the stuff that got called out in Scream, about the rules of the slasher movies. There's also like in those types of movies, there's always this narrative of the impure characters are the ones that get killed. And
Yep.
so, in that sense, and maybe this is a little bit more psychoanalytic, the killer actually represents um, an element of oppression against people who are too expressed.
Yeah. No, I mean that's kind of a fair read, because the way that you would have to look at slasher films, particularly from a psychoanalytic model, is that the killer is the least oppressed, and then
Hmm.
he kills people progressively to create a world that has more and more oppression. But at the
Right.
same token, like his force is forcing that rather than allowing it to grow naturally. And so
Hmm.
that killer is the one that is causing the oppression to happen, because he's starting to kill the people that are less repressed down to the
Well,
last
yeah.
person. But on the same token, you could also spin it kind of the opposite way and say that he's showing what happens when you go full tilt unoppressed and unrepressed. What happens is danger, and
Right.
his killing of those people is because they were close to the danger, not necessarily because he's like this moral force. So I think it would depend on how you're looking at it, but I would see both of those as cogent inside of the psychoanalytic model.
I would agree. And also, I just realized that you could take that reading and say that Friday the 13th is actually a revenge movie, the first Friday the 13th, that Jason
Yeah.
Voorhees' mother is actually taking revenge. And so what she's doing is by becoming completely unoppressed, she's able to kind of purify society from the people who caused the death of her son.
Yeah, and the thing that makes that movie interesting too is like on the one hand they're not the people who did it, but
Right, exactly.
they're doing the same behaviors, and so
Exactly.
that
Yep.
behavior set is the thing that's interesting. And like in a certain sense there's a feeling like, well, all these kids are innocent, but on the same
Hmm.
token, what made the other counselors not innocent is that they were doing drugs and having sex and paying more attention to other counselors and drinking
Right.
and not doing
Yeah.
their job.
Right.
And that's something that's very interesting with the all the movies from the 1970s, but slashers in general, is that there was this, and you know the psychoanalysts talk about this, so we're still inside the picture for anybody that's wondering,
Yeah,
but
yeah, 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 yeah,
um
yeah.
there's there starts to be a breakdown of patriarchal culture in the like 60s through, you know, like the 2000s, where there was a lot of
Hmm.
divorce and families were split up, and what ends up happening is that the father is taken out of the family, and children are mostly raised by what's now a single mother or a co-parenting mother, and the dad has very little custody. And so what starts to happen is that there's a societal fear of this system breaking down and there not being any law and order and harsh repression and oppression, which the male figure promotes, you know, if you're looking at it in a binary male female. And so you also in those movies see a lack of police, a lack of adult males, a lack of men in general. The only men that
Mm.
are in those movies really are fuckboys.
Yeah,
It's
and the
it's like
killer.
yeah, it's like fuckboys, sluts, a babysitter, three children, and a killer. Is like
Yeah.
most of those movies.
Hmm.
And you know, I use those terms specifically just for anybody that's wondering, specifically to emphasize what we're talking about. You know, no
Sure,
moral
sure. Yeah, yeah,
connotation
yeah,
on
yeah,
those.
yeah, yeah. Of
Um,
course.
but the thing that's really fascinating about that is that you create a situation where there is no law and order, which is
Hmm.
exactly what you were getting at previously with the, you know, the monster lacks any repression or oppression or repression, because when you do that, that's the extreme antithesis of law and order is no repression and no oppression, because law and order
Yeah.
are oppression when you refuse to repress yourself. It's like for instance, you only get a DUI if you refuse to handle yourself while you're driving and
Right.
drinking.
Right. Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and so it's like they're the societal mechanism, and so in those movies that's completely lacking, specifically because that was a fear that a lot of people had. And what's interesting too is that like the babysitter being the virtuous like girl is continuing the like, you know, patriarchal heterosexual system,
Hmm.
and she's also being like a good girl because she's taking care of the younger children, which would have been her role historically.
Sure.
And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of elements in that that are really interesting. And it's one of the things I find fascinating about people who love horror films is the vast majority of them are not conservative, but the moral story in a lot of American horror from the 60s, 70s, and 80s is incredibly conservative. Like if you look at what the story's telling you, like slasher movies in
Oh
general, they're
yeah.
basically saying like, don't have sex, make sure that you keep your marriage intact. Children should only be in marriages, and like if you're married, it is like a thing that you should be doing, and you should take it very seriously because promiscuity is bad, partying is bad, children being alone is bad. We need this patriarchal society, because the answer to literally every slasher movie is where the fuck are the police?
Yeah, well, and
Every single one of
also,
them.
I mean, the other thing about some of the classic slasher movies, like specifically Nightmare on Elm Street and the Halloween movies, is the real story. And I think what makes those fascinating is that you have someone who's totally unoppressed and unrepressed, like Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers, and then society comes in and oppresses them through, killing Freddy Krueger or by incarcerating Michael Myers. But then they refuse to be oppressed. And so they escape and then they continue their kind of unabashed, unrepressed behaviors. And so the whole point of the story is that you have this absolutely liberated person, and then society has to come back and reimpose order, or else more people are going to die. And
Yeah,
in the case of Freddy Krueger, there's like this, even death couldn't like stop him from carrying out like his like unoppressed and unrepressed desires.
yeah, though I would point out in both of those examples too, they're still showing how impotent like the society is and how impotent the
Right.
parents are, and they're
Hmm. I
impotent
agree.
specifically because of these like moral failings.
Yeah.
So like the parents in Freddy Krueger have the same, like they're partying too much, they're doing too many
Hmm.
drugs, they're getting divorced, they're cheating on their spouses.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like this whole sex and drugs are evil thing that's
Right.
lying in the background of that, because it's like the parents try really hard to oppress Freddy. Like they literally murder him,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
but they still fail. And it's like the failure seems to be in the same, it's the same symbolism that's in all the other movies.
Hmm.
And that's the thing I'm finding fascinating about what you're talking about. And it's the same with the mental institutions in the Michael Myers movies. They're
Right.
empty, they're dark, the people are weak, and he just completely overruns them. And again, that's the thing that's interesting is like you want to attach to a character that can completely overrun all of the oppression and repression in the society, because that's super liberating. It's like the maximal liberation you can get.
Yeah.
But on the same token, he's only able to do that because the society is so weak. And that's something that's like kind of a common fear in horror films, is like, is our society weakening? Are we being taken over by things? Are this thing too big, this thing too small? Because right, like the thing that people were afraid of really through like the 40s through the 60s was aliens and poltergeist and demon possessions and these different things that would allow some other ideology or some other person to come in and like take over your mind or take over your
Hmm.
neighbors.
Right.
And
Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Like it's that trope that you see all over the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s horror movies. Not really the later 70s, but up until I'd say 72, 73.
yeah, and the thing that's interesting is like these lines of flight and through different historical eras, they, you know, they're very prevalent in a period, but they're generally, there's like a beginning tail, a big curve, and then like an end base to it.
Hmm.
You know, it's like, I mean, even today, like they're still making vampire movies. You know, it's like
Right.
there's kind of like a never a full need to end it. But the thing that's interesting is they're always shifted a little bit based on the fears of the time period. And that's one of the things that's interesting as we get further along in history. I wonder how much people are going to look back at horror films from today and be able to take them seriously. Like I wonder if, like, you know, somebody 50 years from now is going to look back on our movies and be like, these really aren't that like fantastic. I don't get it. Like, what are they even talking about? Or what's going on? Or like, why the fuck would you do it that way?
Yeah.
Just because of the way society changes. I mean, again, I would point out the way that cell phones kind of ruin like any horror narrative. Like,
Oh
um,
yeah. Yeah.
they've started to make them more interesting because they have to be involved in them. Like the as the Scream movies have aged, you know, now we're in like five, six, seven. I think they're about to make eight. Um, as you have that many of them and they've gone through time, now we have ones where they have cell phone issues, and you know, these kind of more modern questions are taken apart. But the further back ones, just they don't make a lot of sense societally, and they don't make a lot of sense with what you can do. but
Yeah. I mean,
but movies like
slashers
in
absolutely don't make sense anymore.
yeah, I mean, I think there's still like a space for slashers, but they again they've shifted, right? Like
Right.
the
You have
scream
to have
movies are
something
not.
like Terrifier, for example. I mean, like maybe that's one that makes more sense now, rather than, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah, and I would point out again, like the Scream movies, the shift that they've had is that they were very much stuck in the same patriarchal stuff at the beginning, right? Like
Hmm.
in the
Yeah.
very first movie, her parents, like she lives with her dad because her mom is dead, her dad is never around,
Hmm.
and the parents are never around. That's why they're having party, like the kids can have parties and do all this stuff because the parents are not around.
Right.
Whereas as you get further along in the movies, they're more and more about interactions with people and who's the killer
Mm.
and kind of more interesting things in that. Like the underlying story is about like adults who live in an adult
Yeah.
world, and
Yeah.
it's not about like, you know, because one of the reasons you can talk about the patriarchal society so much inside of classic slasher films is because they're stories about teenagers,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and so the teenager should still be being taken care of by an adult. But once these characters are actually adults, then you end up with a
Mm.
different moral thrust because they're the ones that it should be taking care of it. They're the ones who do take care of it. And I think that's kind of more what you see. And again, like It's a Wonderful Knife is a slasher movie, I think from 2024, somewhere around
Oh, okay.
there. It's pretty
Yeah.
recent.
Mhm.
Um and the question in there is not like, wow. Well, now that I'm thinking about it, though, it has all of these same fucking issues. Like, because once she goes into the world where she was never born, her brother gets killed by the killer, which breaks her family down. And so, in the new world, that's the actual horror world that she goes into, her parents have exactly the same problems. Her dad is completely checked out. Her mom is just boozing and doing drugs and cheating on her dad like so blatantly. She's like cheating on the dad like in the kitchen,
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
blatant.
yeah.
And so I'm trying to think about more modern slasher movies that would show this. And I think Terrifier is one that you could point to, but specifically because that movie is so abstract. You know, like I've seen that movie like 3 times and I still like, there's not a very easy to follow story unless you're following Art the Clown who's just like showing up at places.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I like my sister loves those movies, but I find them very tiresome because there's so much of this societal stuff lacking. It's just like Art the Clown shows up and like kills somebody. It feels like the first one feels like 3 vignettes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Um, I mean, I think the first Terrifier does have some pretty classic, like, it's got some classic, like, monster movie elements to it. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I find Terrifier to just be kind of shallow. It's just kind of like, Hollywood was like, oh, people are afraid of clowns, and they're afraid of clowns because they might get killed by clowns. And here's this movie where a clown goes around killing people. Like that's it. Like
Yeah, I mean,
there's not a lot of deep stuff going on in Terrifier.
yeah, I would agree with what you're saying, with the one exception that that was a low budget film, almost entirely funded on like Kickstarter or GoFundMe.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Well, then forget everything I said then.
but
It
I mean,
was some
I
person
agree
who
with your
was
sentiment.
like, people are afraid of clowns. I bet I can make a movie about a killer clown. Give me money. And then they made it. Okay, cool.
That's probably more accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, so spinning this all the way back around about this kind of distinction between Carroll and psychoanalytic approaches and other approaches is that the psychoanalysts really have this position that the monster is the expression of, full tilt lack of oppression, lack of repression, and that's why somebody would be interested in being the killer, being
Hmm.
one with the killer. And so there's this constant identification, not identification, identification, not identification with the killer. And
Hmm.
to take it back to the dream thing we were talking about earlier, this is something that happens in dreams. Sometimes you're the victim, sometimes you're the perpetrator of things. Anybody that's honest about their dreams and pays attention to them knows that sometimes you're a villain in your dreams. Not always, and some people obviously more than others, but having that experience is because part of you kind of craves that. And in the same way, these movies give you or these books or whatever give you the opportunity to be the villain for a little while. And again, there's a troublesome feeling to it, which is why you might want to flip flop back and forth. And I think anybody that's an honest watcher of horror films would know that sometimes you feel identification with the killer and sometimes you feel identification with the main character, and sometimes you flip flop back and forth throughout the movie. Like like I really love Chucky. Like I watched the
Hmm.
show, I've watched all the Chucky movies, I've seen all of
Yeah.
them. And I feel an identification with Chucky because I like him better than most of the characters in the movies. And so
Yeah.
like watching those movies kind of fucks with me emotionally because like I'm like he's doing bad stuff and whatever, but he's like so cool. Like I want to hang out with him, like does voodoo and stuff. Like he's cool. Um, so I find him fascinating and interesting to watch and entertaining. You know, I would do some stupid shit like kidnap a Chucky doll and like MK Ultra him to be like a nice. Like I would be stupid enough to do some stupid shit like that, like they do in the second season of the Chucky show. I don't think you've seen that show, but they Chucky like create like there's a system where like there are all these like Chucky like partial souls getting put
Hmm.
out. So they're like hundreds of Chuckies, and they're attacking these kids that are in this Catholic school. And so they kidnap one of the Chuckies and then they duct tape him to a chair and like tape his eyes open and they make him watch
Hmm.
like Care Bears and Barney and like all these like how bad people feel after being hurt. And they do this for like a week and then he becomes good Chucky.
So it's like a Clockwork Orange if it was Chucky.
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, they brainwash him to be nice. And anyway, it creates a very, very fascinating story afterwards. I will not ruin it for
Oh
anybody.
man.
But that's some
Uh,
good shit.
I'm
But
just
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
oh no, I'm just picturing Chucky sitting there like, yeah, I was cured all right.
Oh man, he gets sick. He like throws up. It's
Yeah.
awesome, dude. The Chucky show is fantastic because
Okay.
Don Mancini, who wrote the original one, like finally gets creative control back over it.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
He does some awesome crazy shit in there. And for anybody that's seen the movies, it's just like Easter egg after Easter egg after Easter egg after Easter egg for the movie to all the
Okay.
movies. So it's fascinating. Like he takes it back over, has really awesome creative control over it, and references back to all the previous movies. So it's chef's kiss, amazing. Highly recommend.
So I was going to say one of the types of horror movies, and probably my favorite type of horror movie that I think really kind of transcends time, or at least it doesn't get bogged down with modern technology or become unrealistic, are supernatural movies, especially like ghost stories and demon possession horror movies and horror stories. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk about why we might be fascinated with these type of monsters because these are the type of stories that fascinate me the most. I love ghost stories. I love stuff about like the occult and demon possession stuff. And I think that for me, the fascination with the monsters there is because it addresses fear of the unknown and also kind of the deeper mysteries of life that can never really be fully known. Especially with ghost stories, right? There's no way for us to know for sure if there's anything like after this life. If consciousness goes on, there's no way to actually know that because none of us have been dead. Um, and there's no way to like prove or disprove spirits. You know what I'm saying? And to me, that's really fascinating. And I mean, there are other elements in ghost stories that are fascinating because there's all kinds of different subtypes of ghost story tropes. But I like that, like and not and so for me, it's not like I identify with the monster as much as it's it's interesting to think about because I've always been fascinated by consciousness and what happens after death. Um, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. And I think what's interesting is as you were talking about this, I started to think to myself that even under the psychoanalytic model, those creatures are still representing a lack of oppression and repression. And so,
Hmm.
but they're interested in something that's different than the normal levels of oppression and repression because those are about societal rules and interacting with other people. But when you start talking about supernatural things like demons are not even oppressed by the laws of nature.
Well, that's what I was going to say. They're unrestrained by physical laws. That's the other thing that makes it fascinating to me, is that you have monsters that are unrestrained by the laws of physics and nature, um, and yet they're making contact with people. And anyway, it just it brings up a lot of questions for me that I think are interesting.
Yeah, yeah. As I'm running through thinking about this, it seems to me that there's still an identification character with supernatural. I mean, again, I would point out Chucky. Like Chucky is clearly supernatural too.
Sure.
And so like I feel like you could still connect with those characters, and I think the more unhuman it is, the maybe the more complicated it is to see yourself as it. Like for instance, like the Blob. It's like that's kind of hard to see yourself as a ghost. Um,
Yeah, well, and also there a lot of ghost stories have to deal with someone who was oppressed in life and now they're a ghost and they're trying to come to terms with that. And I think that's something that uh as a viewer it's easier for me to identify with because a lot of times with the ghost story is there's this ghost and they're haunting people and then it's like really scary, but it turns out the ghost is actually trying to bring to light something awful that happened, or there's some type of push for justice that the ghost is trying to bring into people's awareness. So, like, I read a book recently called How to Sell a Haunted House, and the premise of that book is this brother and sister, their parents die, and they die in these kind of mysterious circumstances, and they go to their house, and their mom did like puppet ministry, like she like used puppets to tell Bible stories, and she was like obsessed with these puppets, and then one of the puppets tries to kill like the main character and her brother, and they're gonna like destroy the puppet, but then they like can't destroy the puppet, and then it turns out that the puppet was actually possessed by the main character's mother's brother who died as a child, and his death was like kind of swept under the rug and never acknowledged by the family. And so what they had to do to be free of the puppet was to like find their dead uncle's body who died in childhood and like give him a funeral. And then they stopped being like haunted by the puppet. So there
Interesting.
was like, so it was like this whole story of like how, they needed justice for this little boy who died, and his family never really talked about it or acknowledged him.
Interesting. Because I'm not a big fan of ghost stories, so I wouldn't have known that about the genre. That actually makes me more interested in reading ghost stories. Um, but as you're talking about that, it seems like in a lot of ways it conflicts with some of the things we're talking about, but not all of them, right?
Right.
Like there's a point, and it seems like the narrative you're talking about, there's kind of like the movies or like the book starts, then you build this huge fear of the character, the ghost character, and then it drops as you get more
Hmm.
interested in them, which is really fascinating too because the oppression and repression thing isn't necessarily there. Like you're not interested in, you're annoyed by the character's lack of repression, and then as you start to go through, then you start to see that they were oppressed, and
Yeah.
so that that becomes something interesting. So there's an interesting shift on it there. I don't think that the narrative that you talked about necessarily fits either model better, but I think it fits Carol's models slightly better.
Yeah, I would say so. It probably fits as a little bit more, but also, I mean, Poltergeist, you have a similar thing too, right? Like the whole premise is that they build this subdivision and like desecrate these indigenous people's graves and their sacred lands and all that, and so they get cursed. And
Mm.
so the monsters are actually there to enforce justice for a community that's oppressed, which
Yeah,
is it's a similar story. It's a story of like justice for an oppressed community, but through this narrative of like people's homes being haunted.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting because like what we had talked about was that the monster is this full tilt situation of lack of repression and oppression, but
Hmm.
it sounds like these monsters are coming out doing that specifically to point at a bigger evil that really
Exactly.
needs to be like re-put back together. So something I think that's interesting with what we talked about is like it seems like in horror narratives there's this world that needs to be reconfigured.
Yep. And that's
And
the thing that's fascinating to me as as someone who's spent a lot of time in political science, that what's interesting to me and what fascinates, why I like the monster stories is that they hone in on the need for order in society and also for justice, and how what we're really doing in communities is trying to get this balance between order and justice, because we can be too ordered at the expense of justice, but we can be too focused on justice at the expense of order. And so where is the fine line there? Something else that comes to mind is skeleton key, because that's like the same thing, right? You have the couple who are possessed by these former, house workers in this racist southern mansion, and then they're murdered by their employers, basically in like a racial like hate crime, and then they go on to possess their children. Um, and so like they're not, by the end of the story, I feel like you don't think that they're monstrous anymore. You feel like, well, they did what they had to do to survive. And so they defeated oppression, actually.
so it seems to me like something that you're referencing here is that in a lot of these ghost stories, there's a red herring monster that
Hmm.
we're pointing at as being like, oh, look at this thing that is completely unoppressed and and unoppressed. Yet
Hmm.
that thing is pointing at this higher level monster. And if you think about
Right.
this system, if you think about the system as a whole of like what the higher level monster is, I feel like you have a better understanding of what's going on. Like in the Skeleton Key movies, for instance, it seems like what starts to happen is that you get identified more and more with the slave characters. And as you do that, you start to feel less and less like what they're doing is bad. And I think like you have a similar experience in the movie Get Out, where you once you realize that these people are actually possessed, and then you want the like main personality to be able to take back over.
Hmm.
um because at first you're like, well, why is this weird stuff happening? Why are these people going crazy? Like this is bad. But that badness points at a higher level badness.
Right.
And that higher level badness, I feel like we would clearly call it a monster under Carroll's definition. Like the people that murdered their slaves, or people that killed the little boy, both of those people we would get, or all those people that are involved in that, we would consider them a monster under Carroll's model. Like they're impure, we wouldn't want them to touch us, they're threatening. And and so the thing that's interesting about these narratives, though, is that this red herring one seems to have all those characteristics, but it doesn't. This one does.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's why those type of stories are fascinating to me. And so the reason that I'm drawn to those monsters or fascinated by those monsters is because you have to make a choice. Like you have to decide as the viewer, you have to decide if you are just going to go with, okay, yeah, these possessed characters or ghosts or whatever are monstrous and they're spooky and I'm scared of them, or you have to go to the next level and be like, no, it's actually a red herring for this other thing, and they're there to point you to this larger injustice.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something that's interesting as you're talking about this, because red herrings are kind of a popular element through horror films, but I don't feel like any
Hmm.
of these philosophies really touch on that. I mean, the most obvious one would be the Scream movies, where they like red herring that the two guys are the killers, and then you start to think that they're not, but they actually are. Um,
Yeah.
but there's a ton of that in horror narratives, like thinking this person's the killer, thinking that person's the killer, and none of these models really work inside of talking about that red herring element. And I think the ghost stories you talk about are a fascinating approach to that, because again, I don't really watch those movies very much, so I hadn't really thought about it that way. But they're giving space for noticing that a monster isn't necessarily a monster, and that you can
Well, and
identify with it.
yeah, and I mean, and I think that this really highlights our different backgrounds because you have a background in academic philosophy and I have a background in academic political science. Um, and so, when I or read a fictional book or watch a movie, like I tend to see it through these lens of societal structures and justice and order and power dynamics, instead of these more, I guess, for lack of better terms, like just kind of hardcore philosophic readings.
Yeah, I mean, I have a tendency to see things in like structured order, but because I do post-structural and phenomenological philosophy, I end up thinking about a lot of the societal structure stuff you do as well. Um, but for me, these are personal conversations we've had a lot. But for me,
Hmm.
the major difference is like I feel like individuals create societies, and so I think that that's a kind of a major difference in the way that we think about things, because you have a tendency to think like structure down, and I have a tendency to think
Right.
like individual up.
Yeah,
Because
exactly. And
I mean,
there's a big
I'm a
difference
hard
there.
yeah, I'm a hardcore Foucauldian, right? So I definitely think about like knowledge power all the time and how knowledge power is affecting societal structures. But for me, back to the individual, and for you, I feel like back to like a higher level.
Yeah, and also, I tend to come at a fictional story, thinking, what is the author, what kind of comments are they making about society at large? And what type of questions are they bringing up about society? And I think that probably fits more into Carroll's novel. I mean, into Carroll's model because he's thinking about what is the author's intent. Um, but I'm not necessarily saying I'm thinking like what's the author's intent as much as I'm like, well, what does the story tell us about the communities that we live in, and how we interact with each other and how we form society.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. And I think this is one place where you're really in line with what the psychoanalysts are looking at, because they're kind of looking at like this back and forth between what the narrative is saying, what the society is, narrative society.
Right. And
And
also, I mean, and also I think that something that I mean that all storytelling does is force you as the audience to think about, your place in community with other people, and the psychoanalysts are getting at that too with like the oppression repression dynamics. How much of yourself are you willing to repress so that you don't end up being oppressed by the culture that you're in.
right, and also how much are you willing to step into being an oppressor in order to bring back a semblance of order?
Right.
Because like
Hmm.
order is very important, despite the fact that it's going to limit your freedom. And so it's a balance between freedom and order, freedom and order, freedom and order, freedom and order, which
Yeah.
is something that we are constantly thinking about mentally, but particularly somebody interested in political science is thinking about that kind of balance in a way that, for me, like, on a personal level, a lot of the philosophies I hold ideologically would lead to society breaking down, right? Like, so I have to think about this sometimes too. Is like I think to myself like, oh, the world would be so much better if everybody was like actualized and really present and like here and like doing what they're trying to do. And the thing is like modern capitalist society literally needs like people to like be like making coffees and pumping gas and doing stuff. And if you start opening up people to stop being oppressed and to be more open and more free, as the way I would do if I ran the world, we would create a situation where there would be less order.
Well, right. I mean, that's the whole social contract, right? I mean, we give up a certain semblance of freedom so that, we don't have to worry about our neighbor coming over and murdering us, which
Mm-hmm.
is, the story of a lot of horror movies, right? What happens when you wake up one day and there's someone going around terrorizing you, in your neighborhood? Because we all want to live with this modicum of safety. And because of that, we have to oppress others. Um, Specifically, people who might go on a murderous rampage, like Jason Voorhees or the
Yeah,
dude in Slumber Party Massacre, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And when freedom gets too out of control, that's when you start getting problems. And so yeah, definitely. And I think again, the psychoanalysts do a better job of really hitting on that than Carroll does, because the psychoanalysts are really, really interested in this order, society, the ways that these pieces move back and forth.
Yeah.
Um, One question I would have for you at this point is, I feel like we have delved into the psychoanalytic model pretty deeply. Do you feel like, given your knowledge of it, there's anything that we should have touched on that we missed?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, not without like kind of analyzing different movies, but I mean, we've got a whole, however long we do this podcast to do that. So,
Yeah, I agree, and I think too that now that we've broached some of these other ideas, we can start to talk about them in relation to Carol as we continue through the series. So
yeah. Well, I don't know if we actually answered the question of why we're fascinated by monsters. I think we came up with some theories, some ideas, maybe touched on, why I'm fascinated with certain monsters. So, I mean, but I think at the end of the day, this is kind of an open-ended question and does bring into it brings in a lot of subjective stuff, right? And that's another reason why we can't really nail Carroll down on this question, is because he doesn't. care what we think as viewers because he's more interested in like this formulaic, this is horror, because anything outside of that is subjective and he doesn't want to have an opinion on that because, he probably thinks it's silly other than, you know what I mean? He's probably just like, well, I can tell you why I like it, but that doesn't mean it's universally true. And so why would I even consider going there as a philosopher? So anyway, this has been the Philosophy of Horror podcast. If you like what you heard today, tell your friends about us. If you don't like what you heard today, tell your enemies about us. Like and subscribe, and look at all of our links down here for Mr. Howard's coaching program, for my band, upcoming publications by me, etc. And join us next week where we will attempt to answer the question, are there timeless monsters? Okay. Stay spooky, y'all. Bye bye.